Hey guys, this is the video tutorial for your next sketch. We're going to spend the next 2 sketching sessions working on one portrait. So the first thing you have to do is choose the portrait you want to do. I have pre-selected about 10 different options for portraits. I should have told you in class that if you wanted to do someone different, you need to come prepared with the picture yourself. So unless you have that, grab one of my 10. And then what you want to do is you want to cut it down, straight down the middle of the face. So Ellen here is looking straight at the camera, straight forward. So it's pretty much cutting down the middle of the page to cut down the middle of her face. However, some of the other pictures, this is a different one. This is one I did years ago. The person's head is tilted, you know, not necessarily straight forward. So if that's the case, then you're cutting, again, it won't be down the middle of the page, but down the middle of the face. That way you have lips, nose, and eyes on both sides, and this is all ripped up because I did this forever ago. But basically, since I have this out, the assignment is you're going to do half of a portrait at a time by using this sort of like a book where you can look at the picture and then draw underneath. So you can keep picking it down, or putting it down, lifting up and draw, put it down. That way you can line things up, you can make sure they're the right size. So you'll do one side one week, and then you'll do, oh my goodness, the next side the next week until you have a completed portrait. The goal will be not to have this line down the middle, but I think a lot of this happened from me using as an example and always putting these up and down every time I show it. So you will get to have a completed, fully shaded portrait, but we're going to do it one step at a time, and we're going to use this little method of lifting and lowering to make sure our features are in the right spot and to help us value match. So, as usual, you can pause this video whenever you need to kind of keep up, but you guys will also be doing probably a different portrait. You know, only a handful of you are going to be doing the Ellen one, although you guys will be doing different ones. So you're more of just following the directions, but looking at your own portrait. So this is not necessarily a watch and do as I do kind of thing. So you'll really just need to watch for the first few steps until you understand the process, and then you can either stop this or keep it playing as I give little tidbits as I work. So like I said, you're doing one side at a time. You can choose what side you're comfortable with. I'm going to do the right side first just because I'm a lefty, and you'll be able to see what I'm doing better. So to start this, what we're going to do is we're just going to sort of map out where her features are. And again, we're kind of cheating a little bit with this, but I don't really think there's much cheating in art. It's just using the tricks you know. So you can kind of position your pencil over, you know, wherever you want to start. So I'm going to start with the side of her nose. And then there's 2 different ways you can go about this. You can actually sort of trace over a little bit and put some pressure on. And when you do that, a lot of times that will push your line through, and you can kind of see a dent in the paper. Now if that doesn't work, then you just leave your pencil there, and then you just start to make each little mark, and then you kind of look and connect them. So, you know, you can kind of slide to make sure you're in the right spot a little bit. And I always say just do the main features first, and then you can do some value mapping after. You don't want to press hard through everything, because if you leave too many dents on your paper underneath, when you shade, the shading doesn't go into those dents, and you end up having these like invisible white lines showing up everywhere. So I say like do a few dots and maybe connect the dots, or like I said, just do this where you're sort of sliding it, and then you can sort of just start to connect. Okay. Keep in mind when you're drawing, you're shading this stuff too. So her eye, you got to decide what part you're going to do when. So like this would outline the inside of her eye, but then the shadow ends out there. So you got to kind of mark out both things. So I'm going to do this one first. Again. Okay, always keep looking at your original. Look at where the lines arc and where they don't also. You know, you don't want a big crazy wave for her eye if it's a subtle one. And you don't want it to be perfectly straight if there should be a wave. Okay, so her shadow ends way out here. So you're just going to go through this process and sort of just mark out her features. Make sure, if you are going to do like the press and dent thing where you're leaving a little mark, it is hard to see. I know the camera's not going to pick it up, but if we are going to press and leave a little dent on your paper, you have to really look for it. So you know, this might work best where you're just sort of putting your pencil on there and then sort of sliding. And obviously you can draw by eye quite a bit too, but this is like baby steps. We're just doing what we can. Okay. And I also want to mark out any significant shadows. Like, you know, a nose, there aren't usually a whole lot of very definable lines. It's a bunch of shadows, so You want to mark out any shadows that you can find, and like I said, any part you feel comfortable drawing by eye, go right ahead, but you can always check by sliding that over and making sure your pencil was in the right spot. Okay. And you're just going to value map this whole thing out. Again, once you understand kind of what's going on here, you can be working on yours at your own pace. I'm just going to keep this recording, and I'll keep talking every now and then, because I'll probably think of some nice tips for you. Don't forget little things like the eyelid crease, like here. Okay, that kind of blends right in with the shadow, so that's a good way to line that up, is that crease comes right off of here. Oh, I forgot to say in the beginning, I probably told you in class, but if you're absent and making this up, you can use whatever material you want for this. So I'm using a graphite pencil. You can use charcoal if you're more comfortable with that. Just keep in mind that, you know, you've had a little bit of experience with each of these, and graphite is not going to get you a solid black, and charcoal is going to be very smudgy, so with each one you have to kind of know what your results will be and how to control the medium. Okay, so mark out the side of her face. This is kind of the one spot, like the edge of the face, where you can maybe get away with doing a little bit more of this kind of pushing and leaving a line thing, because I'm not going to make you shade the background, so if you leave a dent on that very edge, it's probably not going to show up, or at least be a big deal if it shows up. Okay. I barely see what I'm doing, but I think you can. I know this does seem like the faster, easier way to do it, but it really is annoying when you do this, and if you get all your values right and then you have these white shading lines left all over your paper, usually you're going to be like, oh, I wish I didn't leave those. So try not to do these for everything. Okay, mouth starts here, comes down to here. Okay, keep in mind the thickness of things, so when you do her mouth, you need to do the bottom of her bottom lip and then the top of her bottom lip. Because this is such a lengthy assignment, normally I have like a finished product to show you, but I don't have the time to do this twice to show you as how I work and the end product, so you'll just have to trust that this works out, and that Beyonce example hopefully helps a little bit. Okay. Definitely value map, because I think getting the shadows in the right place are just as important as putting the features in the right place, because the features cast the shadows. So if you have shadows that are in the wrong place, it makes the features appear like they're also wrong. Okay, hair can be a tricky thing. Actually, I think short hair like Ellen's is harder than long hair, but you know, just to get started, just kind of get the outline for where the hair ends. You can barely see that one. Sometimes if you tilt the page, you can see those indents a little bit more, and if you can't see them, I'm going to just go through and press through one more time. There it is. Okay. Ear. Okay, sometimes it is tricky to slide this out of the way, but you know, this is doing your best. This is supposed to be an aid, not necessarily a do-it-all-for-you thing. You still do have to look and pay attention and use your judgment. Okay. Remember important shadows, smile lines, creases, shadows. All those things are important. Watch for mistakes, as you know, I just made a mistake there. Correct them as you make them, don't just continue on. And if you are going to eyeball a lot of it, do check. So if I drew this by hand, I would want to slide that back under to make sure that I was about in the right spot. With teeth, I usually say don't get too specific. Usually if you just do these little V's or these little triangular shapes between the teeth, that usually serves as enough of a reference to the teeth that you don't have to actually draw out each individual tooth. Especially once it's shaded, you'll see how that works. Okay. Now there's always more you could do. But if you think you have most of your values mapped out, you could start shading. I do always think it's best to start and get your darks in, like things that you're very sure are black, you can start to put in. And that will help start to define the face a little bit. But again, if you are going to go in with a black, be extra sure that it's where you want it. You map things out right, because once you go in super hard with your pressure, it's really hard to get rid of it. So go ahead and do that if you feel like you've double checked and everything's the way you want it to be. For the sake of time, I want to map out this highlight too. If you're mapping out a highlight, which you should do, map those out super light, because you don't want to see the outlines of a highlight. They should gradually fade away, so you don't want to press too hard accidentally mapping out a highlight. This highlight means you really shouldn't have much there at all. Okay, and then what you can do is once you're ready to shade, if it's too annoying to go back and forth, you can pull this off. But I do really like to use this. I hold it up close to test my value, so when I'm doing up here, you know, I'll put my value in and then I kind of cover it up to see if I'm matching the value okay. It is a lot easier to tell in person. One, the camera doesn't pick up too much here. And it's a lot easier to tell with the darker values than the lighter ones. Okay, and if you're doing graphite, you know, obviously there can be a lot of streaks, and some people like the pencil liney look. If you don't, you can always smudge it in and soften it. I tend to end up doing that. The streaks, as much as I think I like them, sometimes they do end up driving me a little crazy. Okay, but remember, with graphite, you can always soften down that edge. Same thing with charcoal. So if you're getting a lot of streaks, color a little bit on scrap paper to get yourself a flat edge you can kind of work from. You can also use a blending stump. I just have a habit of using my finger, and I didn't actually grab a blending stump when I came in here. Okay, make sure you leave your highlights highlight color. Okay, anything that's a highlight, I usually don't even touch until the very end, because sometimes you can just leave it the white of the paper, or you can just smudge in from what you have already shaded. So I don't really mess with that too much until I have nothing else to work on. Okay, make sure your value changes are appropriate, so the right level of contrast between, you know, mid and shadow. But you can build up those shadows, so you don't have to go straight to super dark. Oh, and you can, I don't know if it's picking it up, but right here I have a little line, an indent line from where I traced. I could probably work that in there a little bit, but those usually will show up a little bit no matter what you do, so you do have to be very careful. Okay, direction matters with hair. So with eyebrows, hair, make sure you always color in the direction that they are growing. So eyebrows tend to go kind of side to side, diagonal-ish, and then, you know, towards the end of it they usually start to curl and grow down. So I know it sounds weird, but kind of touching her own eyebrows kind of helps you figure things like that out. If you are working from a picture, like you can't really see the texture of her eyebrows in this picture, so you can use your own as sort of a reference if you're not sure. And even though graphite does not get true black, you can get it pretty dark. So I do say, you know, wait to go heavy dark until you're sure. Make sure you do go in and add in those darks. And if you're not sure, like I always do things where I'll sort of bend the paper and then compare to see if my dark matches with that dark. I try not to crease the paper too much, but it is good to always double check and be sure that what you're doing is what you intended. Try not to talk too much because I don't want to talk your ear off if you are still watching. But, you know, make sure you take note of what really is the darkest part of each feature. With nose, it's usually the nostrils or just underneath it, depending on if the nostrils show or not. With the lips, it's the crease between the eyes, or between the lips and the inside if it's kind of an open mouth smile. With an eye, there's usually, you know, the shadow from the lash line, but then there is this highlight from like the inside of the eyelid. So try to catch all those things as you go. Don't just blindly say, okay, here's underneath the eye, I'm going to shade it in gray. Like, look for where it changes, and those little subtle things really make a big difference if you can catch those details. Okay, like how much of the white of the eye is actually white. There is some shading inside the whites of her eye. The edges of the pupils are the darkest. The only time you really don't see it is in people who have super dark eyes. Sometimes it's hard to tell. And usually the pupil has some variation or striations in it, so don't just, again, blindly color things in one color. Watch for those highlights, map them out if you need to. Keep an eye on the size of the pupils. If they're too big or too small, it tends to look weird. And they can look really, really odd. One of the things, if you take certain drugs and stuff, your pupils can dilate or constrict, so you can make people look really crazy or really messed up if you don't pay attention to that stuff. When you're drawing, the size of the pupils matter. Okay. If you're not sure if something's dark enough or not, just move away from it for a while. Come back to it later. You can always darken things up later, but it is a little bit more of a pain to try and erase something that you made too dark. So that goes for skin tones or eyes. Okay. And also keep in mind, you know, on this face, even if you are white as your race, you're not really white. So things that are left white are reserved for, you know, strong highlights. Teeth are whites of the eyes. Everything else should have some sort of shade to it. Might be a very light gray, but it should be something. If there's a strong flash, sometimes that will whiten out the picture, so that's okay. But make sure it really is white and not just a very light gray. Like her skin is pretty much all light gray, even these highlights. The strongest highlight she has there is on her forehead. So there, I will leave it white until I'm done, and then maybe I'll add some shading around it. Okay. When you're coming up to the edge, that's a great way to judge the skin tone and the shading you put in, is how well your shading matches the other side of the face that you were not working with yet. And that will be a challenge in the end, is to kind of fade in that line, because you are going to get a line. But fading that away and kind of trying to hide it the best you can as part of this assignment, so learning how to fix things like that. Okay, again, I'm watching to leave that highlight around her eyelid and lower lid. Try to remember to color in a consistent direction, or at least a direction that kind of mimics the feature you're working on. Or if you are going to change directions, make sure you do the shading as softly as possible so that those direction lines are not showing up. Remember to sharpen your pencil if you're working on something that needs some detail. Sharpen your pencil so that you can actually get that detail accurately. That's something I always have to yell at myself about because sometimes I get lazy. Okay, this area right underneath her nose is where we have one of those strong black shadows. And this project should be one that takes time. This should not be something you do in 20 minutes. If anything, this is one of the sketch assignments where you might have to turn it into homework, because to do it well you really have to go slow, and 40 minutes for each side is doable. But if you need more than that, I wouldn't be at all surprised. And because I don't give a lot of homework, I don't feel bad about it. If you need to work on it at home, then please work on it at home. And the lips are pretty dark. Again, I'm going to use the picture next to it sort of as a guide. But it is a guide because you can see, I think, the right side of her lips are darker than the left. So this is not the only thing I'm looking to compare. That's going to get me started, but then I'm always looking back at my original picture. Okay, and this area inside of her mouth is one of those true black areas. Okay, mouth is like a cave, like the light's not going to go in there super deep. So, forgot to mark out the bottom of the teeth, so I'm just going to, and again, they're just like little triangles. The more each tooth separates, you really, it is not necessary to draw the lines between each teeth, because you typically don't see them unless it's like a really high resolution photo. You don't see the lines between every tooth. Sometimes you'll see it between a few if it's starting to curve around, like here you can sort of see one, but definitely not between all of them. And some of these back teeth tend to be a little grayer because they are kind of heading into the cave, I guess that I called it. So they only get a little bit of light that's reaching through to them, so those things you can darken. Just people tend to make the mistake of adding too much detail that they don't really see, and that will make things look wrong. Okay, and I usually like to go back to teeth later. I feel like when you draw them by themselves, it gets very confusing. So I kind of just hint at them and I get them started, and then I wait until the face is done to really see what I need to adjust. Make sure you're aware of your hand. So if you're moving over, make sure you're not scraping or blending something that you just very carefully shaded. So you can always get a scrap sheet and lay it down over something that you don't want to be smudged as you work. Okay, the lip also tends to have a highlight towards the middle of it. Think of it like a tube or something, like a Pringles can. Because it's round, the middle top of it would have a highlight you need to make sure you include. Now, graphite doesn't smudge as easily as charcoal, so I don't have to be quite as careful. But always be aware of where your hand's rubbing against, especially if you're like moving your hand a lot and not just your fingers. Okay, and I think, yeah, the camera is picking up. See this little line here? that is from where I did that press through thing. So again, I can sort of squeeze my pencil in there to fill in that little dent, but it is really hard to completely cover it up, so just use caution. If you do make your lines too big and too denty and you can't fix the shading, keep that in mind for the second half. You know, I really don't mind mistakes as long as you do learn from them. So if you have things you don't like on your first half, when you move on to the next side of the face, show me that you've learned from them and try not to repeat those mistakes. Okay, you can see she's coming along. Definitely not done. I have a lot more shading to do, but the features are starting to show. And there's lots of little details that maybe won't get caught on camera for this tutorial, but I will try and go through and get some of these wrinkles she has, some smile lines. But you don't want to get into that kind of detail at first. That kind of stuff comes after you've established the skin tone and the shadows and the form of the face. If you try to get into details too fast and then you have to work around it to get the basic stuff, you tend to mess up all those details you worked so hard on. Don't be afraid to jump around. I jump around all the time. If you see a mistake, it's kind of, unless you're in the zone with shading something, it's not a bad idea at all to go and fix it while you see it and can identify it, because sometimes you'll lose it and you can't figure out what's wrong because you didn't fix it right away. Make sure you pay attention to the subtle shadows. You know, there's the deep shadows that are really easy to see, but then there's also really subtle ones, like here. There's like a secondary shadow to the nose. It's not as deep as this first one, but it does sort of separate out and leave a little highlight there in the middle of the lips. And like the difference between this value and this value. It's very subtle, but it is darker underneath this little triangle. Those separate a really good portrait from an okay portrait. Whenever you are filling in a dark area, I always try to start and make it smaller than I think it is, because I can always expand it, but again, taking it away is tricky. So I'm kind of staying inside the line of where I feel like this is, but I'll pull it out. Double check whenever you want to make sure things are where they're supposed to be. If something doesn't look right, ask yourself why and try and figure it out. rather than just blindly filling things in. There's a very subtle highlight right in the middle of her chin. Look for those on the chin, cheekbones, middle of the forehead, ball of the nose. Lots of places you need to keep an eye on for highlights. Some are going to be very obvious, some will be really subtle. On the same note, making certain shadows too prominent can make features look bigger, so keep an eye on that also. If you have too deep of a nose shadow, it can make the nose look bigger than it really is. So you can either lighten it, or you can darken up every other feature to match it a little bit. If everything gets darker, then it sort of will balance out, but you just got to be careful if you do things like that. Take too many liberties and it won't look like this person that's very recognizable anymore. I always do a lot of squinting. I'm sure you guys see me do it all day in class. That does help me look past any textural things or minor details, and I can kind of just look at the values and see if they match the way I want them to. Right now the thickness of her lip doesn't look like it's there, so I'm going to line this back up. And yeah, that needs to be much, much thicker. So, you know, play that game where you're looking at something and just try to ask yourself what could possibly be the difference that you can catch and add in there. Thickening a line, thinning a line, darkening a line. Adding some texture, smoothing out some texture. You know, for those very, very light values that you're afraid you can't get light enough, then smudge to get them. Push them in with your finger. Okay, watch for things like this. Like right now, her nostril is really bright white, but here, yes, it's a highlighted area, but it's not at all a bright highlighted area. So again, I can smudge in there to get that, or I can shade it in, or a combination of both. The hair, luckily she's got very high contrast hair with the shadows we see in here, so you know, just like we've done before, value map out and use both sides of the picture to kind of tell. With hair you can be off a little bit as long as you have the general direction and the general shapes of things. If they're a little too big or a little too small, it tends to not be a big deal. Just make sure you don't lose sense of it, because a lot of the stuff like just ends up looking like weird little zigzags and lines. So it might make more sense to do a few and then shade them so you can get the overall. So you don't lose track of what these things actually are, because it is easy to lose track of what these weird shapes are, what's supposed to be the light area, what's supposed to be the dark area. So. Once you know something's a shadow and you know you drew it right, you can go ahead and just fill it in. And again, direction's important. So if her hair is sweeping to the side, I'm coloring side to side. Don't color up and down if something's flowing a different direction. It will totally throw off the illusion you're trying to create. So where her hair is growing down, I'm going to color down. Where it's swept to the side, I'm going to color to the side. Really makes a big difference, especially with hair. If you're trying to fill in a tiny area, that's one thing, but in general, keep those pencil marks in a consistent direction. And same thing with her hair, like the highlights. They may not necessarily be white or true white, so make sure when you get those in those, it's really important to follow the direction, because that's what's going to make it look like hair, is those texture lines and those other parts that you're going to fill in. So I will keep working on this so that I have a finished example for one side up for you in class. And as usual, if you have questions for me during class when you're working on yours, please ask. And good luck.